Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is the stirring success story of the mountain gorilla, and it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Russell Gerber. Russell, thank you so much for being here today. I, like a lot of the viewers today, love gorillas, so I'm going to turn it right over to you. Let's get started.
Thank you, Sunny. Always a pleasure to be with you and all of our guests out there, and lovely to be back in the new year presenting to you all. I hope you all had a good festive season, or silly season as we call it down here in South Africa, and I'm sure you're starting to get back into the swing of things. Today, a topic, of course, close to everyone's heart, and I thought a lovely way to start off the new year with a reminder of some of our most positive conservation stories that we have in the wilderness these days. Often things that we see in the news and conservation stories can feel quite disheartening at times, and the gorillas really is a wonderful story of success in how ecotourism has worked so closely with conservationists in the area to create a wonderful environment experience, and most importantly, a growing population of gorilla or mountain gorillas in this area. So that's what we'll be chatting about today, and I hope you're all excited. And of course, at the end of our little presentation, if you have any questions or anything on your mind, just let us know. So as I like to start all of our webinars, just a little introduction of who I am. This was me on expedition to Madagascar with a little brown lemur. This was on a natural habitat trip as well. A few years ago now. We haven't been able to get back to Madagascar with all of the restrictions over the last few years, but very excited to be heading back again there this year. So slightly different topic, but if you are keen on making a visit to one of the most interesting islands in the world, do come and join us in Madagascar. But a little bit about myself, so that you know, I do know a little bit about what I'm talking about at times. I actually have an undergraduate degree in zoology and African vertebrate biology. I did my postgraduate honors degree in marine biology, and then moved into the safari world as a field guide from 2004. I then went into some marine field guiding all over the world in places like the Bahamas, Thailand, Mozambique, and even the United Arab Emirates for a time. Over the last few years, I've been working as a wildlife presenter at Africam TV, which has been loads of fun as well. But of course, most of you would know me from my work as an expedition leader with Natural Habitat, of course, and I've been with them since 2018. And actually just got back from a long trip to Uganda and Rwanda, hanging out with all the gorillas for two wonderful trips. Only got back around the 20th of December. So really nice to have that experience and have guests, of course, traveling with us and enjoying those wonderful areas with us. And that, of course, is what we'll be talking about today. So as I say, just a little bit about myself and my background in the world of safari and African travel. But today's topic, also something that I like to do in my webinars, for those of you who've watched one of these before, I do always like to go through just a brief outline of what we'll be covering to give us all just an idea of where we'll be going with our chat today. Firstly, we'll go into what is the mountain gorilla, how are they separated from the others, and what makes them so special compared to the other gorilla species that there are out there. Some of you may not know that there are other gorilla species. So we'll start with that. We'll go into where they are found as well, which is a big part of the conservation efforts in place and that have been in place, and of course going forward. We'll talk about the threats that face these animals, that have faced them in the past and will face them in the future, things that we have to consider whenever trying to come up with a conservation plan. We'll talk about some conservation history, where it all began, where things were looking pretty bleak for the gorilla, and then moving into the positive situation that we find ourselves in today, which is always a wonderful, as I say, a wonderful thing to be able to to say these days that we do have these positive stories. Then we'll go into where we are now in terms of the numbers of the gorillas, how things are looking in the parks. As I say, I was there not long ago at all, so I can really give you an up-to-date snapshot of how things are. And lastly, we'll go into how you can help. And of course, coming to travel with us is one of the biggest things that we can do to enjoy the animals and also contribute to their conservation. And we'll go into various other ways you can do or can help with that at the end of our webinar this evening. So yeah, that's the outline for the day, for the evening for me, for the day for many of you. And without further ado, let's dive right in. So as I said, the first thing I wanted to talk about is what is the mountain gorilla. So the scientific name is actually Gorilla berengei or berengii, depending on who you ask. And it's one of two subspecies of eastern gorilla. It's listed as endangered by the IUCN, which is, again, part of the wonderful positivity of the story. Before we even get into more details on that, the IUCN actually took them off the critically endangered list because of the numbers increasing as they have been over time. Sometimes that can be met with criticism because we don't want anyone to feel that we're starting to lessen the intensity of our conservation of a particular species, which can sometimes happen if you're moving in that direction. But for the time being, it is a very positive thing that it's actually moved from critically endangered to endangered. As I mentioned, there are two populations as well. One is found in the Virunga volcanic mountains of Central and East Africa, and generally within 3 national parks: Ngahinga in southwest Uganda, Volcanoes in northwest Rwanda, and Virunga in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we'll go into more detail of those areas a little later, and I'll show you where they are. The other population is found in Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda as well. And some primatologists believe that the Bwindi population is actually a separate subspecies, but that hasn't been actually confirmed as yet. And as it stands from 2018, and again, we'll go into more of this, there are around 1,000 individuals of mountain gorillas left in the wild that we currently are aware of. In terms of the gorillas themselves, though, and characteristics, of course, they are pretty much uniformly black, as you can see here. It's generally thicker, the fur itself, in the mountain gorilla, and longer than that of other gorilla species, which of course enables them to live in colder climates. The nose prints of the gorilla, or the nose itself, and we'll get some pictures later on as well that you can see a little closer, but each of those nose prints is almost as unique as a handprint for us, and is one of the ways that scientists and conservationists will identify different individuals in a group. The males can reach a standing height of around 171 centimeters, which is about 67 inches, and a girth of around 64 inches, an arm span of about 2.7 meters, or about almost 9 feet, and a weight of around 400 to 500 pounds, again, depending on the individual. So the males are significantly bigger, with the females being at around about 200 pounds maximum size. This particular subspecies is smaller than the eastern lowland gorilla and other subspecies of eastern gorilla, but in some cases, the males themselves have been known to be some of the biggest individual gorillas that have been identified. So the males, of course, are responsible for looking after the groups. So carrying on with our characteristics of these species, as I said, the males tend to be the, well, I guess the matriarchs or patriarchs of these groups, and are in charge of pretty much all their behaviors and where they move. And because of their size, they're of course responsible for protecting all of the individuals in the group. And the adult males themselves have actually got these pronounced bony crests on the top and back of their skulls, and it gives their heads a more conical kind of shape. And the crests anchor these powerful temporal muscles, which of course attached to the lower jaw and allow them to have a much stronger bite force than the females. The females do also have these crests, but they are not quite as pronounced. And of course, all of them have these beautiful dark brown eyes. When you're out in the bush and trying to take pictures of them, the big brows on the front of their faces, of course, also makes it difficult to get a picture of their eyes. So whenever they look up like this, for you photographers out there, that's always the best time to get a quick snapshot and get a little glint of the eyes themselves. As I said, those big brown eyes are framed by a black ring around the iris. And of course, the adult males are called silverbacks, as many of you will know, because of a saddle of gray or silver colored hair on the back of on their back that develops at around about 12 to 15 years old. The females never actually get that silver hair, but you can have more than one silverback in a group as well, which is something a lot of people are not aware of. They're mainly terrestrial, as you would expect, with their size, and generally walk around on all fours or quadrupedal. They do climb into the trees, though. We actually had a number of them climbing on our last trip out there to get at fruits, if they are fruiting, if the branches can carry their weight, of course. And like all great apes, other than the humans, of course, its arms are longer than its legs. So they've got almost a sloping back as they walk, which is a type of basically knuckle walking. They walk on the ends of their knuckles, basically with their knuckles down on the ground like that, and you can see it in the tracks quite clearly as well. And that, of course, can support its weight, and it's rather than supporting its whole weight on its palms face down. So interesting way of walking, and what you would think would be an unusual way of moving around. They're very dexterous in the trees, as I mentioned as well, but spend the majority of their life on the ground. They're diurnal, so spending most of their time active in the day, eating for the most part, and they're big animals. They eat mostly, almost solely vegetation, and they need to eat a lot to sustain that massive bulk that they have. They generally feed early in the morning. They rest during the late morning and around midday, and in the afternoon forage again before resting each night. And each gorilla actually builds a nest from the surrounding vegetation, and they make a new one every single evening. And it's one of the ways that the trackers will actually go and find them each morning. They'll head out in the early morning before we head out on our gorilla walks, and they will head to the areas where they last saw them, check on those little nests and see where they've moved on from there, as they really don't tend to move around at night at all. Each one sleeps in their own nest, as I said, and the infants do sleep with their mothers. At around sunrise, they head out and start feeding again, unless it's really rainy and cold, in which case they'll actually stay in bed a little longer, just like we do if you're not happy with the weather outside. It's actually quite funny, and one of the stranger and more interesting characteristics of the gorillas, they really do enjoy sunny and warm weather. They try to stay out of the sun because they do actually sweat just like we do. So they like cool, temperate weather. And as soon as it gets rainy and nasty, which of course it does a lot in the mountains, and it can get quite cold at those higher altitudes, they actually really don't like that. Will often then go under some thick brush or bushes or trees and try and stay out of the rain as much as possible, generally huddle up to avoid the cold. And until that eventually clears, which it normally does after a few minutes or half an hour or so, then they'll generally carry on with their day. This was another shot taken on one of our recent trips of a beautiful young blackback who was looking through back at me as we were all hanging out and watching them in their group. The gorillas themselves, of course, are, as I said, this is another female and are often on the outskirts of the forest itself, not always in the deep forest. Some of the foliage around here, and it's something we're going to discuss later on, that you can see in this particular picture, is actually a gorilla adjacent to some tea plantations. And the tea is generally not something that they like to eat, and it keeps them from moving too far out into the agricultural lands adjacent to the forest. But it is certainly something that we see often, and in a lot of our photographs, you would actually often see that they've come to the edge of the forest and you see some of these agricultural areas. It's one of the major pressures that they are facing, and it's something we will discuss in a little while in terms of the threats facing gorillas going forward. This was another shot taken of an individual walking up a pathway just on the outskirts of the forest, caught in some beautiful light, walking towards me, another young blackback. He was on his way to becoming a silverback one day, and a beautiful young specimen, and eventually he will become a silverback and will often then move away from the group itself. This was in fact a silverback. You can't really see it in this picture, of course, because his back is facing away from us, but it does give you a little indication of that conical head shape that we were discussing a little earlier, and the type of head and size that you do encounter when it comes to the silverback themselves. But what's remarkable about them, of course, is how relaxed they are. They are so chilled, and whenever we're with them, it really is incredible to me how they're just not interested in us in most cases at all. They don't even generally look in our direction, and funnily enough, you can sit with them and they laze about like this, like it's a wonderful Sunday afternoon with nothing to worry about in the world. But most of the males eventually leave their natal group, and around 60% of the females will actually leave their group as well. And that is, of course, one of the ways that they do distribute their genes into the various other groups around the forest system. Males leave when they're about 11 years old, and often it takes quite a long time. They come back to the group, they leave a little while, they come back again until they eventually feel brave enough to move off on their own. They may travel alone with an all-male group for a while, which is quite common, for 2 or 3 years, and they'll see if they can get some females to join them from other groups. It's very common for them to steal females from other groups, and again, allowing that a little bit more mixing of the gene pool itself. And the females in their natal groups will emigrate or leave the group normally when they're about 8 years old, either going to an established group or beginning a new one on their own with another lone male. And again, it's something that we've seen in all the different locations that we visit in Rwanda and Uganda, where entire groups have started from a single lone male and a single female, and that male slowly then attracts more and more females to increase the group size as much as you can. So that's certainly the way that they tend to move around. And as I mentioned to you, the silverback generally then starts his own group, and once he's got his own group, he determines the movements of the group. He leads them to different and appropriate feeding sites at different times of the year. He mediates conflicts within the group, and of course protects them from any external threats. And when the group is attacked or has historically been attacked by humans or leopards or any other gorilla potentially, the silverback is extremely protective, and he will often protect them to the death, to his own demise. And it's one of the reasons why early on the poaching of gorillas was so detrimental. Early on, many zoos around the world, of course, were trying to get hold of young gorillas as display or for display in their various zoos, and in actually getting those young gorillas, often you would have 5, 10 gorilla individuals, adults, who would die in that process because they would literally fight to the death to protect the group, and almost always the silverback would be included in one of those being killed. So they really are ferocious when it comes to protecting their family, but when you see them, habituated silverback, of course, and you get close to them like that, you cannot believe how calm and relaxed they are as an individual. So that's just a little bit about the gorillas themselves. and a bit of background on the species. And as I said, these of course are mountain gorillas that we are discussing. There are other species as well, the western lowland gorillas, and we mentioned the eastern lowland gorillas as well. The western lowland gorillas tend to be doing much better. Their numbers are fairly good. Still a lot of concern about their populations, but nowhere near what the threat to mountain gorillas had been. But a little bit about the areas that we've just been discussing. Of course, I mentioned already Rwanda and Uganda, but just quickly to indicate to you where you're likely to see these large individuals. Well, it really is in quite a small area. And this is just a lovely map of Africa that I like to use, showing various major watercourses of the country, or of the continent, excuse me. And as you can see, it's that only that location that you will find mountain gorillas. And coming in a little closer to give you more of a feeling of what that would look like, as you can see here, this is the range of the mountain gorilla, and you'll see the border is the white lines on this particular slide. You can see Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda. And those are the only three countries where these mountain gorillas occur. In the top half of your picture, you will see the Bwindi Impenetrable National Park, which is the one group that we spoke about. And then the other groups making up the three different regions, the Virunga National Park, the Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda, and of course the Mgainga Gorilla National Park in Uganda. So that really is the range that they are limited to, and of course has been one of the major threats to the species, one of the most difficult things that we've had to overcome in terms of their conservation. Because of those limited areas where they're found, of course, they are highly at risk of disappearing. And one of the reasons for that, one of the major reasons for that, has always been the encroaching of our population, the human population, into their territories, which were generally very wooded, a lot of it primary and secondary rainforest areas. These montane cloud forests, they would come lower down, and about 100, 200 years ago, many of these groups would be coming way down into the valleys where mostly the people are living today. And over time, of course, as our population grew, those family groups of gorillas, mountain gorillas, started moving into the more mountainous regions. And it's often suggested that they weren't always mountain gorillas at all, that they actually preferred to spend most of their time down in the valleys. But with that pressure of more and more people, that those populations were forced more and more up and higher up in altitude as time went by to avoid conflicts with people. So encroaching, of course, is always going to be a major problem, and then a more direct issue over the years and historically were, of course, poaching, sometimes direct poaching, where individuals were in fact poaching gorillas themselves, using to paint a rather graphic picture, but would often utilize the hand as an ashtray. But one of the biggest reasons early on was often to provide young gorillas to zoos around the world, or even various people, powerful people around the world. And that, of course, had a huge impact, as I mentioned, because of the nature of gorillas and their protective nature over their families, how many of those individuals were being killed over time. And that became such a big issue over time that it's estimated that there were roughly around 200 gorillas around the time that this wonderful lady first started to start her crusade for the protection of the mountain gorillas in Rwanda in her case, but of course in the area surrounding this particular group of gorillas. So this, of course, is Dian Fossey, and one of the most recognizable faces when it comes to gorilla conservation, and somebody we have to discuss when it comes to the conservation history of the gorillas themselves. She, of course, was an American primatologist, for those of you who don't know that, and a conservationist, and she took undertook an extensive study of mountain gorillas from around 1966 until she passed in 1985 in rather brutal ways, where she was unfortunately murdered in her cabin whilst actually on site and researching these wonderful animals. So a very sad and tragic end, and of course was the subject of the movie Gorillas in the Mist, which I'm sure many of you have seen as well. And a lot of mystery shrouds how she did pass and who was responsible for that. But we're not going to focus too much on that today. What we will focus on is her wonderful impact on where we are today with the gorillas. As I mentioned, she was a leading primatologist. She was one of the trimates, which was the fun little term that was given to a group of female scientists who were recruited by Louis Leakey, who was one of the first real dedicated and famous paleoanthropologists, and he created this little group of research members and known as the trimates. And as I said, group of female scientists who were recruited to study great apes all around the world. The others, of course, being Jane Goodall, who was studying the chimpanzees, and of course Birute Galdikas, who studied orangutans in the Borneo area, I believe. So amazing women who really started an entire movement of the protection of these great apes. But Diane, of course, was responsible for the initiation of protecting gorillas in Rwanda, which of course then spread to Uganda and of course the Democratic Republic of Congo as well. So she spent 20 years in Rwanda studying these animals. She strongly supported conservation efforts and strongly opposed poaching. She was also against tourism for many reasons and was quite anxious about how the impact of tourism, or what the impact of tourism would be. And I never think she ever foresaw the fact that people would want to travel from all places around the world to come and walk into these pristine environments and have as little impact as possible on the gorillas and still enjoy those experiences. So she was totally against the conservation, well, the ecotourism conservation approach. She wanted the animals completely separate, and many opposed her in that. And I think if she was around today, her fund itself, the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, in fact, is in favor of tourism these days because of the wonderful programs that have been created there in the walking safaris to go and view these animals, which of course has the most limited impact on the environment as possible. The biggest example of the positivity of tourism, of course, on these various groups is since the establishment of those tourism groups and people going to see them and money being brought into the area, well, the populations grew from around 250 individuals in the 1960s and early 1970s to what I mentioned to you already today, around just over 1,000 individuals, which have been counted on the last census, which was about 3 years ago now. And coming up in the next year or two, there will be a number of naming ceremonies where they name the youngsters, and it's very likely that we're going to see an increase on that just over 1,000 number, where it was around 1,065 individuals. They're expecting to be at around about 1,200 individuals with the number of babies that have been born in different areas surrounding this region that we've been talking about, the Virunga Massif and the Albertine Rift. So very exciting and very positive things, and something I think she could never have imagined. As I said, she mentioned she worked with these gorillas in Rwanda, which were actually quite wild at the time. They were had not been habituated to people at all by any other scientists. So she had quite a hard time getting them to stay near her, close enough at least for her to observe them. And over time, of course, it just became better and better for her, and she was able to make some absolute breakthrough discoveries when it came to gorilla behavior and understanding their social dynamics. But as I said, she was very hostile to any potential poachers or people even coming into the area for cattle ranching, even agriculture. And with that, she made a number of enemies, and she wasn't sure, I think, how to get around the growth of population with the pressures that had already been placed on the gorillas themselves. So it was a very difficult time for her and a difficult time for the gorillas themselves, but her real push and putting a face to all of these gorillas, the book that she wrote, and of course going on to various shows for National Geographic, she really got the world to see the gorillas and to see how amazing they were, how gentle they were, after always being considered this extremely aggressive and scary animal. And of course, that started to grow this incredible gorilla tourism that we see today. And if you do head into the area, you can actually see her grave site is up where a number of the poached gorillas that she worked with and that she felt so strongly for, she's actually buried with them up in the mountains close to her cabin. So an incredible lady who really began the story and the success story that we are focusing on this evening. And that is, of course, Dian Fossey. And if you're interested in that, do check it out. Go watch the movie. And if you do come and stay with us on one of our trips and we head across to Rwanda, there's a wonderful Dian Fossey museum, which goes through all of these various details of her life and shows the incredible impact she had on bringing the plight of gorillas to the world. So we owe a lot to what we see now to her. And one of the reserves that really jumped onto that Rwanda bandwagon early on was the Bwindi National Park in Uganda. It is one of the places that we visit and a fantastic place for viewing gorillas as well. This area in itself is known as Buhoma, where we visit on our natural habitat trips. And if you do come and join us, this is where we would head. And there are at the moment around, in this particular starting point, around 5 families that we would go and visit. And that's grown from what was initially one little family, and more have been habituated with, they're telling us at least 3 more families that they will be habituating soon. And as I mentioned, the way that it is all structured, it is the least amount of impact. You have 8 people or tourists heading up into a walk led by a guide, and we go to the family, a habituated gorilla family. Each group goes to a different family and you spend 1 hour with them per day. And once that hour is up, we head back down to the camp, and those gorillas have the day to themselves to enjoy and do gorilla things. So as I said, really low impact tourism that was probably not something that Dian Fossey had foreseen as being a successful thing or being something that so many people wanted to do. Another major player, of course, is Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda, which we've just been discussing. And of course, the volcanoes, these extinct volcanoes, are the real striking visual that you do get when you go across there, and a massive characteristic of this area as well. And this is, as I mentioned, the area that Dian Fossey started her research programs on these particular species. So how can you help? And of course, one of the best ways that you can do that is coming out on a safari. And joining us on a gorilla safari not only gives you an idea of the type of experience that we've been talking about and gives you the feel for the very low impact tourism that it is. The other thing is, of course, is that part of all the money that's spent in all these national parks, a big part of it is your permits that go straight to the national park itself, that pays for all of the rangers responsible for looking after these animals, which can be very difficult, certainly in places where there have been political turmoil over many years. These are areas where many park rangers have lost their lives protecting these animals. And Dian, of course, became the most famous and early scientist who almost died trying to protect these animals. But since then, hundreds of local African rangers have been killed by anti-poaching or by poachers themselves, and even, of course, militia groups, etc., with the political unrest in these areas. Rwanda, of course, going through their genocide in the 90s and a civil war, the tourism was massively impacted to these areas. Despite all of those things, it still boggles the mind that simply leaving these gorillas alone over that time and with no real value of the gorillas themselves these days to any black market when it comes to capturing them and displaying them in zoos, with zoos moving to much more ethical practices in modern days, their numbers just kept growing and growing and growing. And even though it does take quite a long time for these numbers to grow, it is incredible if you consider since the 1960s and early 70s that we've had growth of over 750 individuals in what is roughly 50 years, which is remarkable for such a small area. So coming on a trip with us, of course, is one of the major things that you could do coming on a safari. And what to expect on a little safari like that, and a gorilla safari, is, of course, this is us. This was, of course, in Bwindi. It's one of my colleagues, Richard. We were on a photographic safari with some guests in December. And as you can see, incredibly close interactions at times. We are strictly kept away from the gorillas in terms of distance, but every now and again they come closer to us. You try to move out the way. In this particular location, we could move back and out of their way, but sometimes you thick forest back and they just keep coming and can often walk right by you without a care in the world. And that is because of years and years of habituation by the local rangers and guides who have put in so many man hours to create this incredible experience for us, and of course for the gorillas to feel more comfortable around humans as well in general, and not to fear them or be as aggressive towards them if they happen to come across local people who live in the area. So another thing, as I say, out on tours, we do our gorilla walks, and heading out into the jungle itself is often very interesting as we move out there. From birds to all the other animal species that we get, elephants occasionally. All of these things, of course, make for wonderful walking experience. What many people are concerned about is that it is quite tricky, and though it is quite hard to get into some of these locations to view the animals, the truth is it's doable for most people with a relatively good fitness level who can walk for a few hours without stopping, and it really is a life-changing experience and has become one of the most popular safari experiences in Africa. And the reason for that is just the animals themselves. Of course, they are so special to be near, so massive and powerful, and yet so gentle, so playful, and you'll be able to observe them in their natural environment. Sometimes it feels like an hour may be too short, but when you're there, once you reach that hour, it's almost like clockwork. The gorillas almost seem to know that it's time up, and they move off into the jungle and disappear as you're looking on. So really special experiences walking into those jungles with those rangers who are, as I said, such dedicated men and women, create this wonderful experience that allows us to view one of the most special primates that was really on the edge of extinction for such a long time. Through WWF, another way that you can help directly if you're not up to traveling with us, but you do have a passion for gorillas, is of course the World Wildlife Fund. And you can check them out at worldwildlife.org /species/mountain gorilla. And there's a bunch of information on the gorillas there as well, but there's also an Adopt a Gorilla program and other ways that you can donate money to the program. It's always helpful. There are so many people who do need funding, from research programs to the rangers themselves, the parks themselves, who, especially after 2 years of limited tourism to the region, every little bit counts. We're starting to see really good numbers of people coming back again, and the communities around there are so supportive of the national parks themselves, because it does bring in money, that actually part of which goes directly to those communities. And of course, any of this conservation in these areas doesn't work without it. It was something that Dian Fossey also tried to force, to just move people away from that area. Over time, we've certainly learned that conservation works so much better when you incorporate the local people and allow them to enjoy some of the rewards from protecting these species in areas that are, of course, generally very high in poverty rates, very focused attention on agriculture. So farmland is at a premium, and there's very rich soils in these areas too. So that puts a lot of pressure onto the gorillas themselves for people wanting to move into those areas. So without real funding, real income and reward coming to the people in those communities, that pressure comes right back. And it's something that we would absolutely have to consider in the future going forward in terms of protecting these species. Without those communities, it just won't happen. And without tourists coming to visit, it just won't happen. And I suspect that the way things are, and hanging out in those areas as I have these last few months in both Uganda and Rwanda, the massive positivity around the gorillas from the staff at these national parks to the communities around there really does paint a good picture for the future. And I can't see that changing for some time to come, hoping, of course, that there isn't any future political unrest in the area, and of course, any potential hazard to tourism to the area that may stop people coming to visit. Having said that, regardless, you're still going to have those incredible people on the ground looking after these animals. The gorillafund.org is something else you can check out. That is Dian Fossey's gorilla fund that she started in honor of her favorite gorilla who was killed by poachers. His name was Digit many, many years ago. And it's another thing you can check out as well if you're interested in supporting the gorillas. But the best thing you can do, of course, is come and visit us and try and get some of these kinds of shots and take some pictures of these incredible animals in the wild. As I said, going from roughly 240 individuals to over 1,000, and very likely to be approaching 1,200 by the end of this year. And we'll obviously be keeping a close eye on that. It, to me, is certainly one of the best and positive conservation stories in modern times of an iconic species that could very easily have disappeared from the wilds, considering the pressures that they've been under, the pressures that the people and humans living in the area have been under, and that potential conflict, it really could have ended in a very sad way. Instead, we now found ourselves with an increasing number of one of the most iconic animals on the planet, and hopefully we can continue that success, bringing in more people to visit, coming to see these animals, making sure we keep our impact as low as possible on the animals, and increasing awareness to all the world about how fragile their situation is because of their small little area that you find them in, the small forest that you find them in, and the potential for any change politically in these regions. We're still going to have to stay focused in order to keep this success story moving forward as we go on. So that's really it from me when it comes to the gorillas themselves and this wonderful success story. But of course, we have a little bit of time if you're interested in sending through some questions. This was me in December as well, taken by Richard, where I look very pensive in this wonderful jungle environment. And the gorillas were just basically where we are. If you're looking at this picture, that's where they were all sitting, and they hung out in this open area in the forest for over an hour. And as that hour ran out, they just started moving into the thick bush, and we went the separate way. And it was just one of the most wonderful gorilla experiences I've had. So something you could experience too if you wanted to join us one day. And hopefully we'll see you out there sometime this year. So thank you to all of you. And Sunny, if you have any questions out there, let me know.
Thank you so much, Russell. This is just one of my biggest dreams to join you sometime out there. It's wonderful to do it with you vicariously. Your pictures are amazing. Just want to
Thank
remind
you.
everybody that before we start the Q&A, they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. But we already have some great questions amassed. So let's get started. What could we expect if humans encountered mountain gorillas that are not habituated to humans? What sort of behavior would we expect from gorillas who are not habituated?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that I've actually chatted with the rangers on the ground many times, and some of them have been there for 30, 40 years. Many of them even knew Dian Fossey and some of the early scientists who came to that area, and who were involved in those early habituations. And they said straight, if you came across one of those groups with a big silverback, very often the first reaction would be the silverback charging in your direction, generally a mock charge, stopping, making a loud noise, thumping the chest, doing all the things that initially made gorillas these scary animals, you know. In the meantime, the rest of the family would run away. So they weren't out there to attack anybody. They were simply trying to protect their ground. And as soon as you backed off and started walking back, the silverback would then move off with his family. So it was never really any malice coming from the gorilla's side. Unless you were carrying things that reminded them or gave the impression that you were dangerous. So, for example, even now, we don't go into the gorilla sightings with a monopod. You know, anything that looks long and thin, like a spear, the rangers think is still potentially something that could trigger a fear or fight or flight reaction from the gorillas. So all those little things were thought of in the early stages. And of course, habituating them, it literally was a sighting and then you move out. And then the next day, a sighting and you stay for a minute longer and then you go out. And over time, of course, it could take really, really long. Today, it takes them between 2 to 4 years to habituate a group enough for us to start viewing them where they offer these habituation experiences. So those are partially habituated groups, and you're generally much further away, and they don't show aggressive behavior, but they won't let you get much closer to the groups that we visit on our trips that have been habituated for many, many years, and you can get really close to, of course, no further than what is it, 8 meters away from them these days. So yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a very long process.
Does the fact that these groups of gorillas are very comfortable with tourist groups put them in danger with respect to potential poachers that they might not see as a danger until too late?
Potentially, yeah, it is a risk, and of course, controlling who can and cannot access those areas is important, but of course also very, very difficult. It's one of the risks that will always be there with people and animals, and anyone who has a sinister intention when it comes to the animals themselves. It is a difficult one to get around. Like I said, carrying any kind of a weapon or something that would be seen as a weapon is a big part of it. But don't ever forget that each trip that we do, we are approaching these gorillas with rangers and trackers who know the families intimately. The families themselves, the silverback knows their smell, their look, how they look, and we actually often get told this before we walk into the gorillas themselves, but the rangers and trackers will generally do it for us. They make these sounds that appeases the gorillas, that calms them down so that they know you are not a threat. One of them is basically, it sounds like clearing your throat. And then another one is if there's a youngster who's misbehaving and starting to get too close to us, the trackers will often make a sound that goes, oh, oh, oh. And then that actually tells the youngster, okay, you're too close, move away. And sometimes the silverback will hear that and do it to the youngster as well, to basically reinforce that behavior and say, no, the humans are right. Don't go too close to them, stay with me. So they have an amazing rapport, and I think that, you know, the silverbacks and families knowing those people make it much more likely that if those families did come across people that they didn't know, they would probably react in a very different way.
That's fascinating. Have they estimated the maximum number of mountain gorillas there could be theoretically, given that the land they need is limited?
They have. At the moment, Rwanda and Uganda are in the process of trying to expand those parks from Bwindi to volcanoes. I haven't heard much from the Virunga side yet. They do have much more space on their side. So they are looking at that. They estimate that around, certainly for Bwindi, that around 1,000 gorillas, and they're at around about 600 now. So they think about 400 more they're going to be at capacity. The thing is, though, with the nature of these groups, that there were so few for so long, a lot of the science is we don't really know. We don't know how close they can actually live together. If they are more happy nearby other groups, if they, you know, if they would be happier with smaller territories per family group, we don't know for sure. And we have seen family groups' territory shrinking, and yet still not major conflict between the different groups and neighboring groups. So it's hard to know, but without question, as always, with the numbers growing, we will have to grow the parks themselves. And the only way to do that is to then, of course, get buy-in from the communities around there. Generally, you know, these are subsistence farmers. Sometimes there are more commercial farms, to move into a direction of buying out those areas, providing that we can create employment for those people going forward, or an income for those people going forward, and not just move them off a property to rehabilitate. That's always been a bit of an issue from a conservation standpoint, and that will be a difficult issue to deal with in itself. And as I say, it's why we're not in the clear. We're never going to be in the clear for something like gorillas in particular, because there's always going to be a pressure. Even if you have great success, you're going to have to start managing those issues as the populations grow. So we'll have to see how they go. But as I say, the biggest goal at the moment is to try and expand those parks themselves. And if they keep getting the tourism and people keep coming, and it keeps making money, sadly, it's not always what you like to think when it comes to conservation, but my experience, money talks when it comes to all these areas. If we can keep that happening, hopefully we can keep it going in the same direction.
Well, I think you have inspired many people to find a way to join you, because the next series of questions I'm going to throw into one big question. If you could pick only one place to go, Uganda or Rwanda, and one time to go, what would you choose? What's the best season in your opinion, the best place? I know it's an impossible question to answer, but if you were forced, what are your favorites?
If I was forced, oh, okay. No, you can't force me. I love them both, and so you honestly, if you have to pick one, pick either. I'll be honest up front. The permits for Rwanda are significantly more expensive than Uganda, and I would say that I don't think you get so much more of an experience in Rwanda. In fact, I find them to be quite similar in what you get out of your gorilla experiences and the environment and the beauty of the area. So If money is a factor, then certainly Uganda, and money is always a factor. But if not, then either as well. As I said, from a gorilla viewing standpoint and the environment, they're both just gorgeous, and the experiences are wonderful. Other than that, in terms of season, any time of year, really. It can get rainy and cold at just about any time. Because of the altitude, in most cases, it's going to be pretty cool. We were there now in summer, and regardless, it was cool every night. And we had a jacket on in the morning starting our walk. As you start walking, you take the jacket off, and generally a thin jacket, but it was much cooler. So I don't think from a weather standpoint it really matters. For the gorillas, it doesn't. It has no real impact on how good the viewing is, the time of year. You can go any time of year. The gorillas are tracked all year, so you always have an opportunity to see them. So I wouldn't worry too much about a season. Whatever suits you is the best time to come. And so, yeah, from season, no real special time. So I'm sorry that was the most politician answer I could have given when it comes to your question. Literally straddling the fence on everything, but honestly, it doesn't really matter which side and which time of year. I promise you, you will have an incredible time.
Well, it's very comforting to know you really can't go wrong. You can't make a bad choice when it comes to
You
gorillas.
can't.
All right,
Yeah.
I have one final question, and I find this a really interesting question. How did the gorillas react when they first began to see humans with masks on? Was there anything, notable in the way they responded?
No, good. It's another great point. They actually did. They had to almost habituate the gorillas with the rangers alone, with no guests, with the masks on, so that they started to understand it. You're absolutely right. Any real change in appearance for any habituated animal, it's going to have some sort of impact. So it did take some time, not too long, because they of course have really good senses and very good intuition as well, as a species. So they did actually then figure out pretty quickly who these guys and girls were. So it didn't take them long, but initially, absolutely, before any guests were sent in there with masks on, it had to be done just with the rangers in small groups. And initially, there was no real major impact. They were a little anxious from what the rangers told us, but honestly, they all reckon it took about a week, and then nothing. Then they were absolutely fine again. And of course now we all have to wear masks during the whole program, and I'm not sure that will ever change. Not just from a COVID standpoint, they can and do catch viruses from us, as we can catch things from them. So I think going forward, since it became kind of the norm, I think going forward it's likely we will wear masks in all of our gorilla encounters. It really doesn't have much of an impact. And after an hour, you can take it off and start walking back down again. So, yeah, good question.
Yeah, I just want to thank our audience for the amazing, thoughtful, thought-provoking questions. You guys are so great, and I wish we had time to answer everybody's questions. But thank you for submitting such interesting topics for us to examine. And thank you, Russell. I love your presentations, and it's just so fun to learn from you. So thank you again for presenting to us today. Let me turn it back to you for any closing comments.
Thank you, Sari. I really appreciate that. And thank you all of you. As Sani said, thanks for the great questions. Always fun to hang out and chat about gorillas, such a special species, such a positive species, as I've said so many times tonight. Not something we get to say all the time about conservation. Sometimes it's all bad news, but this is really a good one, and hopefully we can keep it going. I really hope to see you out there in the field, folks. Have a wonderful 2023, and we'll see you in nature somewhere. Have a great night. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in today, everyone. Please join us again next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everyone.